Hey, वाहिगुरु जी का खालसा
Waguji ki
वाहिगुरु जी की
fateh.
फतेह.
How's it going?
Not bad, not bad. How about you?
Good. We're not going to wait for anybody to come into the room because they can listen to it afterwards.
Yeah.
So, I think it's been a hiatus of like 2 to 3 weeks maybe since we last talked about this book. To be honest with you, I don't even remember what we talked about. But that being said, the book kind of builds upon itself. So, a lot of the arguments he makes in the earlier chapters rear their heads in the later chapters. So, we get into some juicy stuff in this chapter. Um, and for the audience who's going to be listening to this, this is The Construction of Religious Boundaries by Harjot Oberoi. We've read the first 3 chapters and have 3 other sessions on the page you guys can go back to listen to. There's some rambling with some intermittent, interesting thoughts. This is chapter 4 called Conserving Sanatan Sikh Tradition, the Foundation of the Shri Guru Singh Sabha. Where do you want to start? Do you want to just like go through the chapter section by section, or was there anything in particular you wanted to talk about first?
We can go section by section. Yeah, I do, I think probably one of the most interesting things here is just looking at the British policy, and obviously, when we're looking at the Singh Sabha, it came in response to the British policy of trying to Christianize and destroy this like hierarchy that existed there. But it's an interesting question to see, based on what they were seeing, were they justified?
Mm-hmm.
Um, if we kind of assign a certain morality to like this situation, right? Like, could we say that they were justified in what they did?
Yeah, and we'll I think get to that section. There's some disturbing material in this, especially when it gets to towards the end of the chapter. So we'll talk about that. I think the first thing that's kind of interesting to talk about for this chapter is, you know, sometimes I read these, sometimes I don't, but this just caught my eye. The opening quote he has. Notwithstanding the Sikh Guru's powerful denunciation of Brahmins, secular Sikhs now rarely do anything without their assistance. Brahmins help them to be born, help them to wed, help them to die, and help their souls after death to obtain a state of bliss. This is Max Arthur McAuliffe from his Sikh Religion volume. I'm not sure which one, if it's one of the early ones, probably. But this chapter kind of makes a point of looking into the claim that Sikhism was in decline. Sikhi was in decline when the British came over, and it caused a lapse, or it's framed as by a lot of people, even today on TikTok videos and Instagram reels, that it was a lapse of Sikh ethos in a way, and that's what was responsible for the downfall, and that there continued to be a downfall until the Singh Sabha movement happened. Um, what do you think about that quote, and specifically, what do you think he meant by secular Sikhs?
Yeah, I think he's kind of responding to the, what do you call it? The Sikhs of his time, right? The Sikhs that he was observing. I'm not sure what exactly he means by secular, but my assumption is kind of like the more probably more politically involved and maybe hereditarily powerful Sikhs that were kind of just continuing traditions that had kind of maybe sprouted during
Mm-hmm.
the Sikh Empire and maybe slightly before that as well. But I mean, like it's impossible to deny that a certain segment of the Sikh population were, using Brahmins in these um, in these ceremonies and stuff like that, and were consulting them. That doesn't change the fact, I think, that a lot of our Ratname specifically injunct not to do so.
Yeah.
um, and I mean, one could argue that the very fact that they had to say that meant that some people thought it was okay to do that.
Right.
But yeah, it's just, I think McAuliffe observing what he sees.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's interesting. We talk about this a lot, and this is ammo used by the other side by people to say that there's no separation between the Sikhi and other Indic faiths, or quote unquote Hinduism, or something like that, right? But um, there's a lot of other things that we've read and talked about where there are injunctions, and people did recognize that people were acting against the ethos of Gurmat, and they were called out for it and told to not repent, but correct their views and practices. The other interesting thing in the first part is the whole thing about censuses and number counting and things like that, because a lot of what happens, I think, is there's stuff that the British said, and there's stuff that's in our oral history and popular Sikh culture, and then we have to kind of figure out what do we take at face value, where's the bias, and um, what's truly going on. So then, what did you think about how he kind of described the number of Sikhs, who was included as a Sikh, and I think he even mentioned that sometimes Sikhs were grouped with Hindus, Jains, and Buddhists, which that was kind of the first time I'd seen that they've been lumped with Jains and Buddhists as a population group, because you don't really see too much overlap there in terms of cultural marriage or even like caste or community thing, right?
Yeah, yeah. To my understanding, his argument is that later Singh Sabha individuals were saying that there's been a shortage of there's been a decrease in the Sikh population, and I think part of his argument is like if we define Sikh as just anyone who believes in in the Sikh gurus, then really there was actually not a decrease. He kind of alludes to the fact that like, oh, there's all these sects, and if we count up the sects, they kind of add up to actually, I think a couple million. And he kind of estimates as well that like there's more out there that were not counted, that were counted as simple Hindus. And it's kind of interesting because on the one hand, what these sects show is that within the Sikh belief, there was a lot of people who might not have specifically identified as Sikh, because I'm looking at the numbers right now. Simple Sikh is just 143,000, right? But like Guru Gobind Singh Ji has, which I assume is basically your standard Khalsa initiate or something, is 542,000, right? Udasi is like 10,000. Ramdasi, which may be just followers of Guru Ramdas or something like that, around 400,000, right? So, like, to the extent that this shows that there was like that they consider themselves Hindu, I don't really know if it goes to that more that maybe there was a, a variety of different sects within the Sikh population.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about this is, this is the British doing what they do best, which is categorize, separate, simplify, right? So um, I don't think it's a stretch to say, they were disappointed when they found people who claimed to be Sikh or Sikh adjacent, but didn't follow what they thought was essential, like the external symbols of their faith, and not following other certain maybe folk religious practices. And so, do you think? I don't want to say they like created a category that separated it or anything, but do you think it was intentional on their part to try to make the Sikh world more exclusivist, in a sense?
I think they were obviously going to be informed by their view of what a Sikh was, which was the Anglo-Sikh Wars had just happened. To them, a Sikh is going to be someone who keeps the articles of faith uh, and is usually engaged in socially like activities and stuff like that. I think they have a definition here for the 1881 definition. I think the Census Commissioner Ibbitt's definition, quote, appearing to be Sikh, or what he termed true Sikh, covered only those who maintained the five external symbols of the faith and abstained from tobacco. All those who did not fulfill these rigid conditions were regarded as non-Sikhs. Any person who could not clearly formulate his religious allegiance was categorized as a Hindu. The colonial state, heavily influenced by Christian perceptions of religion, perceived Sikhism and other native religions in a highly mechanical and utilitarian manner. So, like, I think on this level, I think Singh Sabha would probably mostly agree that, like, yeah, a lot of Sikhs were kind of not able to really articulate what exactly their religious beliefs were, because the British were looking at religion just in a different way. You know what I mean? Like, To the common Sikh, as we've discussed, like this whole entire book is kind of a, at least the first part is kind of a defense of like the 19th century common Sikh, right? They probably weren't like very much uh, worried about what exactly, who exactly is a Hindu and who exactly is a Sikh.
Yeah, it's they really kind of they really put their kind of conception of, religion making, what is a religion, what's a legitimate religion, what's not religion. And it's a foreign concept that kind of slowly but surely, Sikhs had to react to. And I think that's what we get to when we talk later about the formation of the Singh Sabhas and why they were kind of um, so kind of not aggressive, but active in how they were doing things. Let me see what's after this section.
But yeah, I think just the biggest part about this section is that uh, you know, Oberoi is trying to kind of imply from the numbers that it was not actually a decline in Sikh numbers, and if anything, there was actually still an increase happening between the censuses, even before Singh Sabha had started their, movement essentially, and like that, maybe the problem that Singh Sabha was addressing, which was the like shortage or decline of Sikhs, what it's I think he's trying to say it was not actually a problem. Kunal.
Sorry, I had a mute thing on. No, I think you're totally on there. We'll never know the exact numbers, of course, but I think his argument that there was like a flourishing Sikh world with people on the periphery of what we would term kind of mainstream Sikhi was definitely there. In the doom and gloom, I mean, it's kind of interesting. He brings, I think, Richard Temple as someone who's doom and gloom about the Sikhi, and then the other um, person we know pretty well, Joseph Davy Cunningham, who was he wrote one of these very important books, The History of the Sikhs, which is, I think, in a lot of ways, pretty pro Sikh and pro kind of noble Lahore Raj, and in other ways, kind of just sometimes the basis for a lot of stereotypical understanding of the Sikh faith during that time. And so the next section is the foundation of the Shri Guru Singh Sabha Amritsar. Uh, Manshan, you're probably more up to date on this than me, or just kind of remember it since I think you've been reading stuff about this. But if you had to kind of summarize some main differences between the two Singh Sabhas, how would you describe it?
For sure. So Amritsar Singh Sabha is kind of known as the Sanatan Singh Sabha in that their view was that Sikhi is kind of a continuation of what essentially is kind of an ancient tradition that stretches back to the Vedas. And I think one thing that is clear and that the Sanatan Singh Sabha kind of gets flack for is that, or well, it's not brought out enough, is that what they saw their religion as was as the supreme interpretation of Sanatan religion, right? So it's yes, they did think that they were a continuation of essentially Indic Vedic beliefs, but they saw themselves and they still believed in the Khalsa identity. They saw that as the ultimate kind of interpretation of what the Khalsa identity is. On the other hand, the Lahore Singh Sabha was kind of formed by people who were not as ready to accept that Sikhi is just a continuation of the Sanatan Dharam. The Lahore Singh Sabha was kind of made from a lot of people who were in the Amritsar Singh Sabha and they kind of left, started their own parallel organization, and their belief was that from the time of Guru Nanak Dev Ji there was a kind of separation, I guess, like a break with the wider Sanatan tradition, and that Sikhi is essentially, it does not need to be maybe, we don't need to check our work by referring back to the Vedas and stuff like that. It stands kind of completely on its own. And even then, there's a lot of nuance. This is kind of the main narratives of both Singh Sabhas, but there's a lot of nuance as well. Like when by Khan Singh Nabha of the Nabha place writes "Hum Hindu nahi," right? In response to I think a different Bhai Sahib who had said "Hum Hindu hain." his definition of Hindu is also a bit different. There's we can get into this later. Essentially, we are going to get into this later in this book, but that's kind of the basic narrative of the two Singh Sabhas. But what Oberoi is referencing here is the foundation of the Amritsar Singh Sabha, like the first one.
Yeah, and I think the next chapter probably goes, I think, more in depth of the disagreement. So we'll get more information and expand upon, expound upon. Had a stroke. The kind of different interpretations of what might have led to those interpretations. Um, the Singh Sabas. So let's see.
I think,
So yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I was just gonna say it might be interesting to start from like why Sikhs at that time felt the need to start this Singh Sabha, and there was kind of a cultural mission. I think they use a Latin word for it. I forgot which one, but it's like mission civil, like basically the civilizing mission of the British, right? From the time that they
Yeah,
took over Punjab,
yeah,
which was in part to kind of Christianize it. And at first, actually, I think they make the point that at first the the missionaries, the Christian missionaries, were actually not enjoying state support. But this kind of changed, especially after I think 1857, the 1857 mutiny in India, where after that British officials were kind of much more sympathetic, I think, to trying to Christianize the natives of India and tear them away from what they found were heretical traditions and stuff. So there was that, but I think it was in 1873 when four Sikh students, I think somewhere in a college in Amritsar, basically, very publicly declared that we are converting to Christianity. And that kind of prompted the leading, Sikh intellectuals and leaders at that time to come together and say, like, what is going on? You know what I mean? Like, we've been conquered at this point, and not even being conquered, like our whole entire faith is now being attacked by the powers that be.
yeah. Was this before Dilip Singh converted?
This was, I think, after, because I think
After,
they'd
yeah,
taken.
okay,
I think that was kind of part of the underlying worries that was happening. They had taken the leap sing. The leap sing, I think, was made to convert probably like at least by the late 1850s. He was definitely like in England and had basically become a Christian, right?
sure.
And I think by this time around 1873, he was probably just he had. I don't think he had quite come back. I don't know the exact
The
timeline, but I
timeline,
don't think he
yeah.
had returned to his Sikh roots.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's interesting. There's other people have written a lot about how the colonial government was different in different parts of India. And there's something called the Punjab school in terms of how they ruled and kind of the relationship between the paramount power and the royal houses as well as the public in general. And it is seems some kind of arbitrary kind of how things are. So if someone with a more religious background, missionary background came in, they could undo the work of quote unquote kind of secularism and letting the natives kind of do what they did beforehand. But definitely, I think the mutiny had a lot to do with it. They've all over India, even though Punjab was known to be one of these people who relatively stayed on the British side because they had no love lost for the Mughals and who they termed the Purbias. So yeah, the Christian church, they were backed by the British officials, and as the Raj kind of advanced in Punjab, they set up mission stations. They published evangelical literature in native languages. So we're talking Farsi, Hindi, Gurmukhi, Shahmukhi, and they established schools. So the indigenous school system was pretty much just taken over. Kind of the skeleton was still there, and they used it to kind of push their agenda and change the curriculum essentially. Um, so it was very kind of interesting how um, there were a lot of not like people who went native per se, like in the different stories in different parts of India where the Gorasabs kind of followed the customs of the local people, but kind of the complete opposite, where they wanted to impart their um, ideals and religious zeal upon the native population, civilize us like they had done in other parts of the world.
Yeah, and I mean, when I think this is kind of what I was mentioning earlier. From the British's point of view, they make mention in the chapter of, for example, like female infanticide that was practiced, even by the Bedis who were descending from Guru Nanak Dev Ji. And I'll just read this short passage on 223. In the mid 1860s, Haranam Singh, nephew of the ruler of Kapurthala, converted to Christianity. If the upper end of Sikh society was so susceptible, in the eyes of the missionaries, the opposite end of the social hierarchy, the vast majority, must have appeared even more promising. The Sikhs had failed miserably in eradicating caste prejudices, and the lower castes among them were denied equal ritual rights. For untouchable Sikhs, the evangelical message of social equality must have appeared highly attractive. Possibly in fear of rapid conversions, Sikh elites started complaining against the evangelical threat from an early date. The outcry became even greater when missionaries acquired an old bunga in the vicinity of the Golden Temple to preach the gospel. So, just it's talking about like maybe the justifications that the British thought they had for doing this, and you know one could argue that like well they were simply finding an excuse, right? Like that maybe they didn't actually really care about trying to upend caste inequality and trying to do things for women's rights and stuff like that. But I think that it does kind of maybe uh, muddy the waters a little bit, right? As to what exactly whether the British were incorrect or morally correct in doing so. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think that's a there's some real politic behind the, of course, religious conversion and caste prejudices and discrimination there. But I think the one that's kind of more glaring and where there's really no counter that I've read from a Sikh perspective is the female infanticide thing. And it's not, yeah, like you said, it was the Sikh elite, whether it was the Bedis that they mentioned, other kind of the Brars of Firozpur, some Sodhi factions who, it's just very heinous stuff that's essentially against one of the main injunctions that Guru Gobind Singh Ji had, right? It was like, no tobacco, don't cheat on your wife, don't have extramarital relations, and not to, kill infant daughters. And so you have to kind of get in the mindset of what kind of society was this where it was acceptable or no one really fought up against it, and why did it take the British to do something about it? They were probably appalled. Um, and so on that end, I mean, I don't think there's probably not too much real politic behind that, other than they probably legitimately believe something bad was happening and they stopped it. So that's where credit is deserved there. But then there were other Sikhs who saw that the winds were changing and were able to stand up to elements within their own community, which were perpetuating this. I think most notably, one of the most famous people of the Singh Sabha came Singh Bedi, right? Where we talk about him later.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I mean, like, again, one of the weaknesses that Oberoi himself kind of mentions is that we don't know exactly what the, you know, rural Sikh thought
Yeah,
at
thought
this
and what they
time,
did.
right? It could be very possible that the practices of some of these elite Sikhs, which definitely, for example, female infanticide goes against some of the core beliefs of Sikhi, that, it was not universally practiced, right? I mean, to an extent, we could say that like even today in Punjab, sometimes we see this, but you know how widespread it was at that time, what the general people thought, I think is and up for debate. And even like you said, like it does not necessarily mean that Christianity needs to be the answer, right?
Right.
And as we see in the Singh Sabad, part of the reason is kind of to answer such social issues.
Yeah, I've never seen actual like literature on what they said or how they did it. But you're right; they wouldn't have needed Christianity to show them that was bad. All they would have to do is show them their own faith, which shows it's bad, right? So um, let me see if there's anything else in this section which is kind of worth talking about. Um,
I think we could like shortly go over just the Brahmo Samaj and
yeah, so
the
the Brahmo Samaj. So
yeah
Um, what I knew about this beforehand, or kind of read maybe even in this book, was it was very popular in Punjab. It was kind of a precursor to other native movements like the Arya Samaj. And there was a fair amount of Sikhs who patronized their events. Some people we would, I guess, term as Sanatan Sikh, right? So there's a lot of um, these early Singh Sabha members who you can read their memoirs, and they'll mention that they met various Hindu leaders or Brahmo Samaj leaders when they were in Amritsar and things like that. And it seemed to have a great kind of influence on the idea of organizing certain intellectuals to counteract what the Christians were doing.
yeah. I forget if he also goes over the Arya Samaj. Um, I forget at what exact point it reaches Punjab, but what's interesting is like a lot of the people who got involved in the Singh Sabha were also involved in the Arya Samaj. A
Yeah,
lot of sometimes at the same time. Um, Even Gyani Dit Singh Ji, I think it's in the autobiography of Lala Lajpat Rai. He toured and did prachar through the Arya Samaj. I think some people now, or not some people, but like the Arya Samaj that we know now is like it's different. I think
right.
from the traditional Arya Samaj in Punjab, and there's no doubting that Swami Dayanand did speak against Guru Nanak Dev Ji, and that is why
There
I
was
think we
such a
see a
break, right?
shift.
Yeah,
Yeah, we see a shift where even like to the point that people were Sanatan. I think no Sanatan Sikh is going to like tolerate such
exactly. Yeah,
insults. So a
yeah.
lot more
Especially,
just
yeah, a lot of
shifted away.
the Amritsar Singh Sabha people, at least a couple of the major ones, broke off at around that point.
Yeah. Um, but yeah, so I mean they're active as well. So to the like part of the reason for Singh Sabha as well is just like kind of trying to create a more Sikh centric, um, uh, trying to create a more Sikh centric version of these things, right? Whereas,
Hmm.
to a certain point, Arya Samaj was in its early stages just trying to reconcile Sikh beliefs and stuff like that. I think eventually, Sikhs are kind of like, no, we need our own thing, which is interesting, right? Because the Amritsar Singh Sabha is saying we are championing Sanatan Sikhi, but they don't simply uh, join Arya Samaj either, right?
Hmm.
They still kind of see a need for something called a Singh Sabha, right? Um, which is, yeah. There's also this thing called Anjuman in Punjab, which was like, I think it was a lot more secular, to my
Yeah,
understanding.
and it was started by Dr. Leitner, who's gotten some attention recently because people have talked about um, how he described the indigenous education system, right? Um, so yeah, he seems like a very interesting guy. So I'll just read this real quick. Of Hungarian Jewish background, Leitner grew up in Istanbul and received MA and PhD degrees from University of Freiburg in Germany. Gave up his position at King's College London in order to take up principalship of the newly founded government college at Lahore. Within a year of coming to Lahore, he became a leading proponent of indigenous education, defender of vernacular language, and tireless champion of Oriental scholarship. This cosmopolitan man, along with Lieutenant Governor Donald MacLeod, helped found the Anjuman-e-Punjab, the Society of Diffusion of Useful Knowledge, as it was called in English, which soon attracted its membership from European administrators, local notables, and fledgling professionals from all over the province. Leitner was quick to give the Anjuman all the trappings of a contemporary voluntary association. Chief among these were holders of office and committee members. Leitner was the president of different committees, were made of charge of education, medicine, business, finance, and examinations for Arabic, Sanskrit, Persian, and Hindu. So he mentions that out of all these kind of bodies we talked about, it seemed to have the greatest impact of Sikh society, maybe because this was something that was secular, so there wouldn't be some hesitation to join it. And we see a couple of the leaders like Atar Singh Bator from the princely state in Malwa. Kame Singh Bedi, Professor Gurmukh Singh, all kind of cut their teeth in this organization. And I think you can definitely see when we read later in the book um, kind of how useful that was for them to organize their own individual Singh Sabhas, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think they mentioned that like a lot of them got their like started orating and debating here. Um, I think last kind of force also present here were the kukas, right? The
Yeah.
uh, now called the Namtaris, who had kind of as we've discussed in previous chapters, they started their own kind of like revolution, right? And it was actually to a certain point, it was actually quite popular, kind of on an underground level in the rural regions. People were never sure how many of them were out there, and they championed a lot more traditional values, right? Like, and even to a certain extent, we could maybe even call them like anti establishment Sikhs as well, right? Like kind of the entrenched Sikh elites, right? Like who had maybe engaged in what they saw as anti-Sikh practices. They stretched, they stressed like vegetarianism and also the breaking of idols and stuff like that. Kind of a lot of the stuff that we talked about in the last chapter, that all this
Hmm.
like village folky Sikhi, like they were pretty
They were,
against that
yeah, they were like the
actually.
first ones super against it.
Yeah, yeah, and I think this is also kind of in response to them as well, because some of this, you know, it kind of caused the British to pause about their relationship with the Sikhs and whether they want to govern with a more heavy hand. And I think the establishment, I think Oberoi does kind of make a convincing argument here that the establishment Sikhs at the time, they didn't quite want to lose the good relationship that they had with the British as a result of Sikhs helping quell the 1857 mutiny, but they also wanted to ensure that this whole evangelical force that was happening was not successful either.
Yeah. Yeah, trying to play both sides, which in hindsight maybe is not a bad idea. Um, but then you get these whole kind of retrospective looking at everyone as a collaborator kind of thing, right? Which I think we fall into quite a bit if you just kind of read things simply without context. Um, I was going to say one more thing about the Kukas that I forgot, but I'll bring it back up if I remember. But do you remember reading anything anywhere about if any? I guess Kukas were technically outlawed and they couldn't overtly say it after a certain point. But if any of them really joined these Amritsar Lahore Singh Sabha to kind of give their flavor or viewpoints on things.
I think, I don't know about them specifically, but I think one of the points of contention actually between the two was actually the status of how they should view the Kukas. Because I think one of the people in the Amritsar Singh Sabha, they published like um, almost like an itihasic text of the Kukas and
Mm-hmm.
Bhai Ram Singh. And I think some people did not like it because it was, very anti-British, right? At a time when, there was no Indian nationalism at this time. There was no
Mm-hmm.
Indian National Congress. It was very dangerous to support the Kukas and stuff like that. So I think he, that person was kicked out of. It was whether or not to kick him out of the Singh Sabha. I think I forgot what his name was. And I think what's interesting is it was the Lahore Singh Sabha people who kind of were more for kicking him out because they wanted to at least publicly maintain an image that they were close to the British Raj. So according to our modern ideals of what like a Sikh should have done at this time, I think it's very nuanced because I think a lot of Sikhs now would be like, "Yo, they should have supported this guy," right?
Mm-hmm.
But you know, some of them did not, and some of them wanted to, not put forward a blatantly anti-establishment image.
No, totally. There's a little section on here, page 237, where Oberoi kind of questions what holiday Sikhs followed, if they followed them, or is this something that was more codified by the Singh Sabha? We've seen Hukuname with kind of certain quote unquote holidays being important. Vaisakhi, of course, Diwali, Deepmala, as it's sometimes called, and I think Dussehra. Um, have you seen any evidence that maybe he's wrong about this? Were there widespread celebrations for events associated with the gurus that you've seen in kind of other texts that we've read? Because I can't really remember something consistent and mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, um, he makes reference to evidence pointing the other way,
Yeah.
but it's definitely like there's hukamname from Guru Gobind Singh Ji, etc., uh, being sure to celebrate Diwali
Mm-hmm.
and other stuff. But I think, to my understanding, he might be right that in regards to celebrating like the Gurpurab of every single Guru Sahib, um, he makes reference to like in their hometowns, like at Nankana Sahib and Gondwal, like people would celebrate Guru Nanak Dev Ji and Guru Amar Das Ji and stuff. But whether it was celebrated on a large scale is kind of maybe up for debate. Which is not to say that like Sikhs at this time couldn't come together and codify this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like a large, and I think that's the thing about just like this debate, right? It kind of assumes that, oh well, if Sikhs weren't doing something in the 1700s, then that means, why are we doing it today, right?
Yeah.
And I think that it's a very like strict way of looking at Sikhi that kind of doesn't allow it to evolve and meet the needs of the time, right? Like part of the most like traditional ways of looking at Sikhi is the fact that the Khalsa has also been invested with guruship, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if the Khalsa comes together and says we want to do things this way, um, to a certain extent, the belief is that that would have the same force of a hukamnama, right? That's why things that come from a Akal Takht are called hukamname. Um, so yeah, like it's probably true, right? Where he says it's hard to tell if these anniversaries or Gurpurabs were celebrated in the past or not. But I wouldn't be too uncomfortable about that fact, if that makes sense.
No, that's totally fair. Yeah, and so why is the 17th or 18th century prized over the early Guru period or the later Guru period or post Khalsa, right? So if you kind of play that game that Oberoi is playing, it kind of doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Uh,
To make like a quick analogy, really quick, it's very similar to debates around like constitutionalism in America,
mm-hmm.
right? Like when the founders wrote the Constitution, like there were certain practices that happened at that time. So should we take the Constitution to mean that those practices are allowed or not, right? Um, and the originalism view is that whatever they thought and whatever um, what's going on at that time, that has to be the way we do things, right? Versus like the pragmatic view is okay, well, let's look at their reasoning, let's look at the principles they were using and apply them to today's issues, which kind of allows, which is kind of the reason for a lot of the laws we have today. And it kind of allows America to grow, right? And to
Yep.
respond to new things.
Have you heard of the idea of like a zombie value or like a zombie ethic or something like that?
I mean, I've heard of the dead hand problem. I don't know if you're referencing
So
something
it's
similar.
like kind of like you were saying, like the intent of the Constitution in the context of when it was made. It was um, it was for a certain idea or value behind it, right?
Right.
So the right to bear arms was the right to kind of protect yourself in your country, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that we can extrapolate it to mean everyone should be have access to uranium or high caliber AK-47s at their whimsy without any like background checks kind of thing. So in the same way, I think sometimes we see something as a rule and don't understand the intent behind the rule or the practice, and then when you try to copy paste it onto modern life and the needs of the time, like you're saying, it's sometimes hard to rectify and can, instead of following the spirit of what was the original intent, taking it, like you said, like literally, will kind of defeat the actual purpose of it.
Yeah. No, exactly. And Yeah, that's I think that's kind of a good way of looking at things today, and I think it's interesting. Both of them, both Singh Sabhas, I think, kind of pick and choose when they want to apply this, right?
Yeah.
And I think we'll get into it in a little bit, I guess, like some of the actual beliefs that they were calling for.
But not the
Yeah,
one people think. Um, so this guy, I'll give a kind of brief background. He was a master of languages, a German guy. I think lived in India. Mostly, I think he did a lot of like Sindhi and that kind of southern area linguistics. And I don't know who was the person who kind of wanted him to translate Guru Granth Sahib. It says the India office sponsored his trip to India, and he arrived in Lahore in 1870. But there's not much in terms of who he was helped by, if he was helped by anybody native, as opposed to Max Arthur McAuliffe, who kind of we know people like I think Khan Singh Nabha helped him, of course. So this guy Trump publishes a partial translation of the Adi Granth. Makes a lot of mistakes. He's misinformed about the lives of the gurus and their philosophy. But since he's the first one to do it, it kind of takes hold in the mind of the administrators. And so, Harjot Oberoi just goes over this kind of briefly. I think a good person to read is probably Mender, since he's spent a couple books talking about the consequences of this and kind of how Europeans viewed Sikhi and how Sikhs viewed Sikhi through their view of it, and how they had to kind of rectify this by putting out their own translation to prove up to the standards of the British that no, we are a legitimate religion, we are a legitimate community, kind of thing. Um, have you ever read Trump's kind of translation or any of his kind of writings on it? Because I found some excerpts of it, and it's kind of laughable in hindsight how bad it is. But I can see how it can totally screw with somebody's head to think that Sikhs are just Hindus in another name, kind of thing.
yeah. I think I've read the intro actually because the intro he mentions a lot of interesting sources that he used. Like for example, like I think it was Ratnama.
This poor translation and understanding of Sikhi.
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, basically the answer was the Faridkot Tika, which was commissioned by Raja Bikram Singh of Faridkot, and it says he commissioned Gyani Badan Singh, um, and there was also a committee under the chairmanship of Mahant Sumer Singh, who was kind of known. Jawala Singh has posted about him. He was kind of known, I guess, for kind of being a master of Braj Pasha and just a master linguist of his own right, and numerous other Gyanis. But what was interesting is like how long it took, I guess, to try to create this translation, or not translation, but steek, right? To
Mm-hmm.
really kind of known. Jawala Singh has posted about him. He was kind of known, I guess, for kind of being a master of Braj Pasha and just a master linguist of his own right, and numerous other Gyanis. But what was interesting is like how long it took, I guess, to try to create this translation, or not translation, but steek, right? To
Mm-hmm.
really kind of ensure that the proper Sikh belief is putting out there. Um, what's also interesting is like who was on there. There's a short passage here. Like these individuals represented different schools of, I don't know how to pronounce this word, exegesis, and it became difficult for them
Yeah,
to
exegesis. Yeah, exegesis.
exegesis.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you're right.
it became difficult for them to arrive at a consensus. Sikhs who did not find a place on the committee were quick to offer their own opinions about what the exegesis project should be all about. The Raja was advised that he make sure that the final version be written in very simple language, be free of Puranic mythology, and that all words from the Adi Granth be given only one meaning. Under no circumstances should there be a multiplicity of meanings, for if there were to be different and conflicting interpretations, people would be greatly confused. The exegesis should turn out to be a precise manual, otherwise it would be plagued by the same problems as Trump's work. Um, and it kind of reflects, I think, just the general mission of the Singh Sabha at this time, which was, trying to answer kind of like questions that had arisen due to the fact that Sikhs were under the British and had to answer these questions, right? And I think it's a bit unfortunate to a certain level as well that they have to adapt. So that's the thing, right? They had to adapt. Like the British were forcing this upon them. Ernest Trump is going through the Guru Granth Sahib and is insulting it, saying that it makes no sense. So they had to do something. They were being told by the British that Christianity's better because it has an underlying logic to it that your religion does not. So they had to do something. It's hard to say. It's hard to blame what anyone did at that time because they were a certain logic was being imposed upon them that they had to match, right? There's also a short passage from earlier. Uh, Sorry, hold up. It talked about like their answers to a lot of things. Huh. I'm missing it right now, but basically,
It's yeah, it's on page. Let me bring it up. Are you talking about the Singh Sabha answers?
yeah, yeah,
It's on 241, and yeah, some of the answers are kind of interesting.
yeah. I think it's interesting just to go through like what they. Yeah, okay, yeah, I was actually right there. So as word of Sabha activity spread across the province, we find Sikhs approaching it with all sorts of questions. Who was a Sikh? Are there any differences between Sajdari and Khalsa Sikhs? Are low caste, Majbi and Jamaat Sikhs to be given the same rights as other Sikhs? Are Sikh men allowed to dye their beards? Can they roll their beards? Can hymns of Sikh gurus and bhagats not recorded in the Adi Granth be recited in gurdwaras? So, I mean, what's interesting also is how a lot of these questions still continue, right? They weren't completely resolved at this time, right? For example, I just saw today on Twitter, someone is asking like, what's the deal with like Sajdari and Khalsa Sikhs? Like, are Sajdari Sikhs, etc. Right? And I guess like it's also interesting to just quickly go over Amritsar's answer to these. So the Amritsar
Yeah.
Singh Sabha's answer was the answer to the first question was entirely unequivocal. All those who believed in the sanctity of the Sikh Gurus and the Adi Granth were Sikhs. Both Sajdari and Khalsa were equally qualified to be Sikhs, and no one had the right to insult the former by calling them Monas. But only Sikhs who had taken the ball and then cut their hair could be called Monas. The word was most inappropriate if used for Sajdari Sikhs. As for low caste Sikhs, they were certainly not to be given the same rights as high caste Sikhs. It was argued that there was no historical precedent for this, and even if efforts were made to reform things, high caste Sikhs would absolutely refuse to marry their daughters to men of lower castes. Sikh men could neither dye their beards nor roll them into a thick bun. Although hymns not found in the Adi Granth were still being recited in Sikh shrines, columns of the Sabha's magazine advised that this practice be discontinued. But then it goes on to mention, like, really, no one could answer everything. And, for example, like, there was controversies about Guru Nanak Dev Ji's birthday, the existence of Bhai Balaji, what Sikhs are supposed to do for birth, marriage, and death, etc. And they were basically trying to answer all these questions and create a code. I don't know if you had any thoughts on this section.
Yeah, so it's the whole idea of trying to create consensus on the fly is hard, right? So, especially in a time where there's a lot more people talking, railways are being made, people are traveling, there's printing presses everywhere, there's different tracks that are being sent out. So, a lot of information can get out, it can be information overload, but then how do you figure out a consensus? And I think, just reading through this book and knowing our culture in general, building consensus is sometimes very difficult, especially amongst Punjabi people, uh, on things that maybe just even happened yesterday, right? So it is kind of interesting. I thought I highlighted something kind of interesting over here. Yeah, so the thing about Bhai Bala, I was saying, Bhai Balaji, right? So do you know what the actual view is now, if he existed or not? Because I think it's kind of interesting if Trump was the first one to bring up his possible non-existence.
Yeah, I think, like, I mean, to be fair, even Kavi Santokh Singh,
Yeah, you're right.
50 years before Trump and stuff, part of the reason why he's writing Guru Nanak Prakash and that section of Suraj Prakash was because, in his view, Janam Sakhi's, like Bhai Balaji's Janam Sakhi, had been, uh, kind of influenced by the Hindaliyas, and you know, he wanted to rectify some of the things that had appeared there that were created to basically prop up this Baba. I think I forgot what the Baba's name was, Handal or something, right? So, but I think to the extent to say that biology did not exist, that I think that probably maybe did start with Trump, and it was picked up by other Sikh scholars, and eventually, I think when they compared them to the Vilayat Janam Sakhi and others, they were like, well, he's not there, he's not by Gurudas Shizvara, so what's going on here? I think, right now the academic consensus is that the Pai Balaji Janam Sakhi is, it's not that it's, I don't, the existence of Pai Balaji, I think it's kind of not, people think he, in the
Yeah, not
academic
decided.
consensus, that, yeah, he doesn't exist. But that doesn't mean that everything in the Pai Balaji Janam Sakhi is like incorrect, I
Yeah,
guess, I was reading somewhere else. I think the comparative analysis of the Janosakis. I forgot who exactly wrote it, but you know that Janosaki goes a lot more into the social nuances rather than simply like just stating, okay, here's what Guru Nanak Dev Ji did. So to the extent that we have like these, conversations of what we believe Guru Nanak Dev Ji said, that's where that comes from. So I think like within the wider Sikh Panth, it's kind of, I don't think people even really think about it, to be honest, in the first place. And
yeah,
in the second place, I think it's still used very much in creating the narrative of what Guru Nanak Dev Ji's life was.
sure. Yeah, I think even like modern depictions or paintings, he's always there with them too, right? Along with Bhai Mardana.
Yeah.
Um, did you want to talk a little bit about the members of the Singh Sabha? Amritsar, should we maybe wait until we get into the next chapter to show their differences? I mean, a couple people, I guess we already talked about Raja Bikram Singh, Khem Singh Bedi. We didn't talk much about Thakur Singh Sandawalia, but I think people are probably familiar with him in his role of trying to get Dalip Singh the throne back, and just kind of being a very interesting uh, guy who tried to do a lot of stuff in a short amount of time.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, we don't really need to go super deep into them, but I think the main kind of unifying factor is that, they were all kind of a part of, somehow connected, I guess, to the Sikh Leagues as it existed before the British came, right? Like
Yeah,
Khem Singh Bedi, Guru lineage, Thakur Singh Sandawalia, he was, you know, fourth cousin of Dalip Singh, I think, just connected to the royal court.
yeah,
Bikram Singh, uh, Faridkot, Raja, right?
yeah,
So they very much made up this kind of traditional Sikh elite that I think Oberoi then goes to juxtapose with the Lahore Singh Sabha, right? And the kind of like new educated class that was kind of questioning everything.
yep. And so, yeah, a educated, a more multi-background, and I think even kind of younger, skewing younger, right, compared to kind of middle-aged, older gentlemen. Um, an example people always like to bring up is um, Hira Singh Nabha was a member of Amritsar Singh Sabha, while his son was a member of the Lahore Singh Sabha, and you can kind of contrast their feelings on the British, feelings on the uniqueness of Sikhi, and kind of uh, compare and contrast kind of the both of their sides by just contrasting them. I think that's good for this chapter. Was there anything else we missed or anything you wanted to bring up?
Um, I think I wasn't sure if it was in this chapter, but I think again just noting regarding the Amritsar Singh Sabha, like obviously they are kind of in the current Sikh narrative, they were kind of the losers, right? Like they
Yeah,
lost to the
yeah,
Lahore Singh Sabha, and I guess Oberoi is kind of like using this book almost to kind of maybe defend some of their beliefs and maybe say that maybe some of their beliefs were more historically consistent, I guess,
Hmm.
with the practice of Sikhs. But I think even on that point, they were also all different people who had different beliefs, right?
Yeah,
Like they mentioned Kanwar Bikram Singh was the one who championed electricity in Darbar Sahib, right?
yeah,
Which,
yeah,
although some people thought it would like, ruin the sanctity of it, he was like, no, it's fine. Khem Singh Bedi, on the other hand, like he's established schools for girls, right?
yeah.
Which was not is not a very quote unquote traditional thing to do, but he did it. So the kind of modern dichotomy that we've assigned like retroactively to the Amritsar Singh Sabha and Lahore Singh Sabha sometimes doesn't actually quite hold up because again, like they're all very educated, nuanced people. You know what I mean? Like it's hard sometimes treating them as a block, I think.
No, I agree. Just they all have very interesting lives within themselves, and for some people, there are a lot more information versus the others, especially I guess the younger Singh Sabha people. But yeah, they it is a lot more nuanced than it's kind of memed out to be. And sometimes how in this book he kind of in one way presents them as polar opposites, but the more you read it and you kind of see where it really is just sometimes a generational gap, a slight nuance in how they interpret things, what they consider a religion to be versus uh, dharam or kind of what their native faith is. So I think there's a lot more to kind of explore, and I think a good thing to be look into is after we read this book is just to find a couple of the criticisms that have been done of it, um, because even I think looking at the criticisms, they kind of repeat the same mistakes he does, right? So it's kind of two wrongs don't necessarily give the whole picture, or give a right. Uh,
Yeah, I think just one last point, and I think I've
mhm.
kind of stated this already, but like also, the reason for the Singh Sabha was largely, the British kind of imposing the need for it, right? And we might have our disagreements again, like retroactively, but it's hard to say that what they had good intentions, and it's hard to say like what they did was wrong considering the circumstances that they were in, which I think is always very important to consider.
No, totally. And so we'll leave it at that for now. How many chapters of this are left? We've been going it through kind of slowly just because there's a bunch of
I think
stuff.
three more.
But three more, yeah,
Yeah,
okay. We can do. You want to do like one and a half next week and one and a half the next one after?
we can try. I think the next ones
Yeah,
are the
we'll try.
most
We'll see what we get to. We're in
five
no
and
rush
six
to
are the
finish it.
most kind of bulky, I think.
Yeah, and that's just because we're getting close to modernity or kind of pre-independence, where we'll see a lot more conflict and a lot more stuff happening that we have records of. So we'll take that into account. Thank you everyone who's listening on repeat. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
But they